Okay, so you know how Bitcoin's been kind of blowing up everywhere lately?
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to deep dive into this documentary. It's this YouTube video called God Bless Bitcoin,
Catchy title.
right? And they basically say that Bitcoin could be like the answer to a bunch of the world's biggest problems, not just like money stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating how they connect it to stuff like, inequality and
Uh,
even world peace.
Seriously, it really makes you think, could it really do all that? So how do they even start to make that case?
Well, they start by saying that like our whole current financial system, the one based on the US dollar and all that, is like inherently flawed.
Right, flawed.
Yeah, they say it's designed to like benefit the elite, at the expense of everyone else.
It's kind of like rigged.
Yeah, exactly. And they have this really powerful example. They show what one US dollar could buy you in silver back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
Compared to today, you need like $38 to buy the same amount now.
Wow.
It's crazy how much our purchasing power has been eroded, over time.
Totally. Like, think about what your parents could buy with $1 when they were kids.
Exactly. It's like this hidden tax, they call it inflation,
Yep.
that hits people who can least afford it the hardest.
It really makes you rethink the whole idea of what money even is.
Yeah.
So how does Bitcoin even fit into all of this? Where does it come in?
Well, they present Bitcoin as this like digital gold,
Okay.
this safe haven that can't be messed with by inflation or manipulation. They make a big deal about how Bitcoin has a fixed supply.
Right, like 21 million coins.
Exactly. It can't just be printed endlessly like regular currencies, which is what leads to that inflation we were talking about.
Okay, I'm following. So it's like digital gold.
Yeah.
But what makes it better than like actual gold?
Well, they argue that Bitcoin is way more practical for the digital age we live in. It's easier to transfer, to divide, and to verify than actual physical gold.
Mm.
Plus, the blockchain technology behind it offers this whole new level of transparency and security.
Right, the blockchain. That's the other thing we always hear about. Can we break that down a bit? What makes it so special?
Imagine like this giant public ledger, and it records every single Bitcoin transaction.
Okay.
That's essentially what a blockchain is. And what makes it so unique is that it's not controlled by any single entity.
So it's not like a bank or a government controlling it.
Exactly. It's controlled by this distributed network of computers all over the world.
So it's like this global system, and it's like tamper-proof.
Yeah, pretty much. Every single transaction is verified by multiple parties, making it super, super difficult to hack or to manipulate.
And that's a big contrast to traditional financial systems where things are, more opaque.
Totally. It's a huge difference in transparency.
That makes sense. But how does this empower individuals? Like, what's the real-world impact?
Okay, so they use this really compelling story about a family escaping the Soviet Union, and they were only allowed to take like $100 per person.
Wow, so they're fleeing this oppressive regime.
Exactly. And they're highlighting how Bitcoin could have helped them keep their wealth during that crisis, instead of having it basically taken away by the government.
It's like a way to protect your assets.
Right. And they also talk about how it's being used in places like Ukraine, where people are using it to receive aid during the conflict.
In Argentina, where it's helping people bypass capital controls.
Exactly. So it's providing financial freedom in situations where traditional systems are failing.
It's really interesting how they connect those real-world situations to this technology.
It is.
Now, they don't just talk about the practical stuff, though. They also bring in some religious and ethical arguments.
Oh, yeah.
God bless Bitcoin, right? I mean, it's in the title.
Right, right.
So they actually dive into how Bitcoin aligns with values from different faiths.
Like, for example, they talk about Judaism,
Yeah.
and they compare how the Torah has been passed down through generations, with each generation verifying its teachings.
Right.
And they say it's similar to how the blockchain works, with that distributed ledger of transactions.
That's a pretty interesting parallel.
Right. And they also talk about how Bitcoin's decentralized nature really resonates with that Buddhist principle of individual validation of teachings.
Like, you don't have to rely on some central authority.
Exactly. You can verify the truth for yourself.
And they even talk about Islam and how the prohibition of interest, or riba, aligns with Bitcoin's fixed supply.
Yeah, that's another interesting connection they make.
It's like they're trying to show that Bitcoin has this kind of inherent fairness built into it.
Yeah, definitely.
They don't shy away from Christianity either.
Right.
They contrast the biblical warnings about, the love of money being the root of all evil with this idea that Bitcoin could actually create a more equitable society.
It's a bold claim, for sure.
It is. And it's interesting to hear them kind of weave all of these different perspectives together.
Absolutely.
But do they actually give any, like, practical examples of how this would play out in the real world? Like, it all sounds good in theory, but how would Bitcoin actually lead to, a more just and equitable society?
Well, they talk about this future where war becomes less profitable because governments can't just print money to fund it anymore.
Okay.
And they see Bitcoin as a tool for people to escape oppressive regimes like that family we were talking about earlier and gain more control over their own economic lives.
That's a pretty powerful vision.
It is. It's definitely a more utopian future that they're painting. But,
Yeah.
there's also the question of whether we're overlooking some potential downsides, right? And how this would actually be implemented on a global scale. There's a lot of complexity there.
Right. And we'll definitely unpack some of those challenges in just a bit.
Before we get into those potential downsides, though, I'm curious about the more technical side of things.
Okay.
Like, we talked about the blockchain, but what about actually using Bitcoin? Like, how do you buy it, store it, make sure it's safe? They kind of gloss over those details.
Right, they do. So to understand that, we have to talk about the idea of a Bitcoin wallet.
Okay, is that like a physical wallet? No, not quite. It's more like, imagine a digital bank account specifically for your Bitcoin.
Got it. So it's all digital.
Exactly. Your Bitcoin is stored digitally, and you access it using this digital wallet.
And within that wallet, you have a public address.
Right, like your account number that you can share with others if you want to receive Bitcoin.
Like if someone wants to send you Bitcoin.
Exactly. But the key to actually accessing your Bitcoin is your private key.
And that's like a password.
Yeah, think of it as like your super secret password that only you know. And it proves you own the Bitcoin in your wallet.
So if you lose that, you're in trouble.
Big trouble. The documentary really emphasizes this. Like, losing your private key is like losing your Bitcoin forever. There's no bank to call and reset your password or anything.
So it's all on you to keep it safe.
Exactly. They really highlight the importance of security, whether it's, storing it digitally or even writing it down and keeping it offline like you would a valuable document.
It seems like there's a lot of personal responsibility involved with using Bitcoin.
There is, for sure. It's definitely a different way of thinking about money than what most of us are used to.
Right. It's not like your typical bank account.
No, and that's one of the big themes that runs through the whole documentary, this idea that Bitcoin is about shifting power away from those centralized institutions, and back to individuals.
But is that always a good thing? Like, what about the potential for misuse? Couldn't criminals exploit this for, illegal activities? That seems like a big concern.
It's definitely a valid concern, and one that we'll dig into more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so before we get into the potential downsides of Bitcoin, let's just take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Okay.
We've seen how God Bless Bitcoin lays out this vision of Bitcoin as, this solution to economic inequality, government overreach, even global conflict.
It's a really inspiring vision, but admittedly a bit idealistic, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But before we get too caught up in the hype, we got to examine the other side of the coin, too. The challenges, the criticisms, and the potential downsides of this Bitcoin-centric future.
Absolutely. So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive, and we'll explore those more critical aspects of Bitcoin in the next part.
So, before we jump into all the potential downsides of Bitcoin, there's this question that comes up a lot.
Okay.
It's like, how does this whole system actually work on like a practical level?
Right, because God Bless Bitcoin kind of just skips over all the nitty-gritty, they paint this big picture. But how would it actually work with millions, maybe billions of people using it every day?
Right, and that's where the whole scalability debate comes in.
Scalability.
Yeah, it's about whether the Bitcoin network can actually handle that huge amount of transactions.
Yeah.
Because right now, it has a limited capacity.
Okay, so as more people use it,
Things can slow down and fees can go up. It's like what happens when, a website gets overloaded.
oh, right, it gets all laggy, maybe crashes.
Exactly. It's like rush hour on the internet, but for money.
That's a good analogy. So that's like a major criticism that people bring up, right?
Yeah, they say it's just not practical for everyday transactions if you have to wait hours, maybe even days, for payments to go through, especially if the fees are crazy high.
It seems like the documentary is just kind of putting a lot of faith in, the idea that technology will eventually solve all those problems.
Yeah.
But what if it doesn't?
That's a valid concern. I mean, there are other cryptocurrencies out there that are designed to be faster and more scalable than Bitcoin.
Right.
But the documentary seems pretty convinced that Bitcoin, being the original and the most decentralized one, will ultimately win out.
There's a lot of idealism in that view.
There is, yeah. It's like they're saying Bitcoin is the only way to this better future, even if the technology isn't quite there yet. It's interesting how they frame it as almost like a moral issue.
Oh,
They argue that Bitcoin's decentralized nature, even with its limitations, is like essential to creating a fairer system.
okay, so scalability is one challenge, but there's also the whole issue of government regulation, right? Like how are
Yeah.
governments around the world reacting to this rise of Bitcoin?
That's another big tension point for sure. As Bitcoin's gotten more popular, governments are trying to figure out how to regulate it.
Right.
Some of them see it as a threat to their control over their national currencies.
Which makes sense. I mean, the documentary talks about Bitcoin as this, like, liberating force, freeing people from the grip of central banks and government control.
Right. But in reality, governments are pushing back, trying to assert their authority over this new financial landscape.
It's a classic power struggle, isn't it?
Totally. Like
Yeah.
we see China cracking down on Bitcoin mining and trading while the U.S. is still debating how to regulate it without, stifling innovation.
Yeah. It's a tough balance.
It is.
The documentary also mentions those central bank digital currencies.
The CBDCs.
Yeah, which are basically like digital versions of existing currencies, but controlled by, central banks.
Right.
And they present those CBDCs as this almost dystopian alternative to Bitcoin.
Yeah, they argue that CBDCs would actually give governments even more power to, like, track and control people's finances.
They even use those hypothetical news headlines, about people getting their digital wallets frozen for criticizing the government.
It's a bit dramatic.
Yeah, it's a bit over the top, but it does raise some valid concerns,
Yeah.
About potential surveillance and censorship.
Absolutely. And a lot of Bitcoin supporters see it as a direct counter to that kind of centralized control.
Right, because with Bitcoin, no single entity has the authority.
Exactly. They believe that makes it more resistant to censorship and government overreach.
But couldn't that same lack of oversight also be exploited by criminals? Like what about money laundering, tax evasion, even funding illegal activities? Those are major concerns for governments, right?
Those are all definitely valid concerns, and it's something that policymakers and law enforcement are actively trying to address.
Yeah.
The documentary does touch on this issue, but they argue that because Bitcoin is transparent, all the transactions are recorded on the blockchain, it could actually make it easier to track illegal activity in the long run.
So it's like a public trail of breadcrumbs that investigators could follow.
Yeah, kind of. But you would need some pretty sophisticated tools and expertise to analyze all that blockchain data.
And that's where the documentary's argument gets a bit shaky, right?
Right. They don't really get into the complexities of blockchain analysis or the resources that would be needed to effectively track and prosecute financial crimes in a Bitcoin world.
It feels like they're just hoping that technology will eventually catch up.
Yeah, there's a lot of optimism there, but in the meantime, there's a real risk that Bitcoin could be used for harmful or illegal purposes.
So it comes back to that balance between encouraging innovation and mitigating the risks. Okay, so we've talked about scalability concerns, regulatory hurdles, and the potential for misuse. But what about the elephant in the room, the wild price swings? One day it's skyrocketing, the next it's plummeting. How can anyone plan for the future with that kind of volatility?
Yeah, the volatility is definitely a major point of contention. The documentary does acknowledge it,
Okay,
but they mostly focus on Bitcoin's potential as like a long-term investment, comparing it to gold.
so they're betting on the idea that as more people and institutions adopt Bitcoin, the price will eventually stabilize.
Right, but it's important to remember that that's still a prediction, not a guarantee.
Right, and it's based on this belief in Bitcoin's future potential, which, not everyone shares.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's definitely a lot of faith involved. Like they're blending this technological optimism with a almost like a religious belief in Bitcoin's ability to change the world.
It's a very unique perspective for sure. And while it's easy to get caught up in all the excitement, it's crucial to remember that there are real risks involved.
So where does all of this leave us? We've heard the arguments for Bitcoin as this revolutionary force for good, but we've also uncovered some serious challenges.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway here is that Bitcoin is not a simple solution.
Okay.
It's a complex and evolving technology with both potential benefits and risks.
And it's definitely forcing us to confront some fundamental questions about money, technology, and the kind of future we want to create.
And those are conversations worth having, regardless of whether you ultimately decide to embrace Bitcoin or not.
Okay, so we've explored both the bright side and the potential dark side of Bitcoin. Now, in the final part of our deep dives, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what this all means for you, the listener.
Right.
What are the potential implications for your life, both now and in the future? Stay with us as we bring it all home. All right, so we've really dug into the whole potential of Bitcoin to like change the world, and we've talked about, the challenges it faces.
Right.
But now let's get personal. Like, what could a Bitcoin-powered future actually look like for everyday people?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, the impact of Bitcoin could be totally different depending on, where you live, your access to technology, your financial situation.
It's not going to be the same for everyone,
Oh,
right?
exactly.
The documentary highlights those stories of people in, countries with unstable economies like Venezuela or Argentina,
Right.
where they're actually using Bitcoin as this lifeline.
Yeah, it helps them protect their savings from hyperinflation or, get around government restrictions.
So in those situations, it's really providing something that traditional systems just can't.
Right, exactly. It gives them a way to participate in the global economy, send money across borders, even access basic financial services without relying on institutions that might be corrupt or failing.
But what about those of us who are already, comfortable using traditional banks, financial systems?
Right.
The benefits of Bitcoin might seem a little less clear, right?
Yeah, especially when you think about the volatility, the learning curve, the potential security risks. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. And for someone who's already financially secure, the downsides might outweigh the benefits, at least for now.
So it's not this one-size-fits-all solution, even though the documentary talks about, Bitcoin creating a more equitable system.
Right.
Could it actually end up widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots?
That's a really good question, and it's something to think about. I mean, we've already seen how early adopters, those who got in when Bitcoin was cheap, have made a ton of money.
Right.
But as the price goes up, it becomes harder for everyday people to invest and, potentially benefit from those future gains.
So it creates this new kind of digital divide almost.
Yeah, exactly, where those who are already, tech savvy and well off have an advantage.
And that kind of challenges that whole utopian vision, right?
Yeah.
That Bitcoin is this great equalizer.
Sure. Not that simple.
Another thing that comes to mind, they talk about decentralization.
Yeah.
But who really holds the power in a Bitcoin world? Right. Is it truly decentralized if a small group of, developers, miners, early investors control most of the Bitcoin supply?
Are we just trading one set of gatekeepers for another?
It's a valid point, and that's why it's important to be critical.
Yeah.
We need to question those assumptions, think about the potential consequences, both good and bad, recognize that there's no guarantee that Bitcoin's going to automatically lead to a better world.
So after all this, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that Bitcoin is more than just a technology.
Okay.
It's a catalyst for change, It's making us rethink money, power, and the role of technology in our lives.
Whether you think Bitcoin will save the world or disrupt it or maybe even just fade away, it's a conversation we all need to be part of.
Totally. The future of Bitcoin and how it impacts our world is ultimately going to be shaped by the choices that we make, individuals, governments, societies, in the years to come.
Well, on that note,
Yeah.
we've reached the end of our deep dive into God Bless Bitcoin. But the conversation doesn't end here, right?
Keep asking those questions, stay informed, and most importantly, think critically about this technology and how it could impact your own life and the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning.